Joining me now from Lynchburg, Virginia, is Thomas Mountain, the renowned and most widely distributed independent journalist in the whole of Africa. Thomas, thanks so much for coming on Going Underground finally. We finally got you, albeit in Virginia, the suspicious state of Virginia, some might say. The UN has congratulated the Eritrean government in the past few days on the 32nd anniversary of Operation Fenkill Liberation of Massawa. Now, many people around the world watching this don't perhaps understand the crucial importance of the region you've lived in for so long. Why is it relevant to the current Tigray conflict, which Joe Biden's State Department often says is a conflict rooted in barbarism, virtual barbarism by Ethiopia and Eritrea? How is it relevant to that?
Well, the Horn of Africa is one of the most strategically critical places in the world because the two largest trading partners in the world are Europe and Asia. And most of their trade passes through the Red Sea, which has got two choke points. One in Egypt, where the Suez Canal, which is controlled basically by the CIA, who pays the salaries of the Egyptian military to the tune of $1.5 billion a year.
Obviously, the Suez Company would dispute that.
Yeah, well, the other strategically critical choke point is the Bab al-Mandeb, the entrance between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And this is what's up for grabs, because who controls the Bab al-Mandeb basically controls the two largest trading partners in the world, Europe and the EU. Now, the United States is no longer dominant economically, but they remain dominant militarily. And so, historically, Ethiopia has been the policeman on the beat for the U.S. to control Bab al-Mandeb. Now, Ethiopia has made a dramatic turn since this coup d'etat the CIA supported by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF for short, and they tried to regain power in Ethiopia at the end of 2020. So this coup d'etat was basically United States trying to reassert their military control over a strategically critical part of the world, the Horn of Africa. So for, whether you or I understand it, whether your listeners understand it, the CIA fully is aware of just how critical the Horn of Africa is. And that's why Ethiopia has been in the firing line of the United States now since they have moved decisively out of the U.S. sphere of influence and become close to Eritrea, which is what's very alarming. I mean, Abiy Ahmed announced that Ethiopia was going to nationalize all the land in Ethiopia. This isn't the first time it's been announced, but he's apparently very serious about it, similar to what Eritrea did. Nationalize the land? Whoa, that's the first step towards socialism. So the Americans are very upset about all this, and they want to have a compliant regime in power, and Abiy Ahmed is no longer their man.
Well, as I said, the Egyptians would say, no, they're in charge of the Suez Canal. I mean, they fought for that one with the British. And as for U.S. support for the TPLF, sure, the U.S. State Department say people in Tigray continue to suffer human rights violations, abuses and atrocities, and urgently needed humanitarian relief is being blocked by the Ethiopian and Eritrean militaries. But I mean, if you asked a congressman or congresswoman in Washington, D.C., there's no money or weapons. What proof do you have that there are money and weapons going to this organization, the TPLF, which we heard up until recently was on the outskirts of the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, ready to overthrow its government for freedom?
Well, I like to say to people that don't believe anything you read or hear in the mainstream media on the Horn of Africa. It's all complete fabrications. It's stories that have been planted in the press and the news by the CIA, the national security establishment in the United States. So all of these propaganda they put out there, I mean, the United States didn't have to give the TPLF any weapons because they were stocked to the gills with weapons. They've got all these caches of weapons all over the country. They had over 100 heavy, medium-range missiles that were aimed at Eritrea, which were one of the first things that got knocked out when this fighting started back in the end of November in 2020. So they don't have to give them weapons. The TPLF has stolen billions and billions of dollars, which they've stashed outside, almost assuredly in the City of London banks, because we haven't been able to find any of it in Switzerland. So they don't need any money. They don't need any
But to be
weapons.
clear,
what
that's
they
not.
need.
I mean, we'll obviously ask the CIA. They once responded to us about allegations made on this program. I doubt they'll respond to your allegations. I mean, are you saying that, say, IMF World Bank money destined for the Horn of Africa has disappeared to the City of London?
Oh, not only IMF and World Bank, billions and billions. The USAID, the World Food Program, all these European aid, it's been just massively siphoned off. I mean, Abiy Ahmed's been trying to get some reckoning from the City of London banks since he came to power in 2018, and they're just stonewalling him.
Salazi would deny that. Abiy Ahmed, obviously the Nobel Prize-winning leader of Ethiopia, and the IMF, World Bank, USAID. Actually, you mentioned USAID there. I mean, they deny all this. Who runs USAID now? And do you see graver dangers ahead because of the Biden administration as regards the Horn of Africa?
Well, the USAID was at one point headed by Gail Smith, who was the person a CIA agent who recruited Meles Zenawi to the CIA way back in 1980. He was the head of for cadre school for the TPLF in the field out in the fighting the war. And 3 years later, he was head of the TPLF.
How powerful are the forces against the kind of arguments you're making? And I have to, I suppose you should remind us, your knowledge does not come from being in Virginia. You're there for personal reasons. In fact, maybe one way of our audience understanding your allegations is the fact that you were in Eritrea when perhaps international headlines of Eritrea were coming out, and what you saw on the ground was very different to what you saw in the media.
Well, my background in the Horn of Africa goes back about 40 years. And in the United States, I've actually taught African history at the graduate level. So, I lived in Eritrea from 2006 to 2021.
You know that Amnesty International, on its website, saying you are basically an apologist for Eritrea and presumably Ethiopia now that they've made peace. I don't know whether you think the NATO countries are happy about them being at peace. What about you being an apologist for the Eritrean regime, as they call it?
Well, that was originally, the Amnesty article was originally an anonymous article, and they would not respond to anything I say. And I guess it's kind of a mark of honor to be slandered by Amnesty because they've got so much to hide about their own corrupt practices in the Horn of Africa and the lies they put out for many years, especially about Eritrea. They had a bunch of their cadre got busted in Asmara trying to infiltrate the country and stir up regime change way back many years ago. So Amnesty's got a very sordid record in general, but especially when it comes to the Horn of Africa, especially when it comes to Eritrea, and now when it comes to Ethiopia. They've exposed their true colors, and I think me being attacked by them is sort of a mark of honor, really, because they never give me a chance.
Amnesty would deny that. They come on this show. I mean, you've got to hear it say Human Rights Watch. Eritrea's government is extraordinarily repressive, subjecting its population to widespread forced labor and conscription, imposing restrictions on freedom of expression, opinion, and faith. They have no legislature in Eritrea. There are no independent civil society organizations. There are no media outlets in Eritrea. What is this focus on Eritrea, and why is it being called the de facto, and it's pejorative, North Korea of Africa? What is Eritrea doing that is so, I mean, it's irritating those in power in NATO countries, but also clearly annoying and angering human rights groups, Western human rights groups?
Well, I wrote an article titled Eritrea, the Cuba of Africa. I mean, Cuba is the only country in Latin America came to power by the armed struggle. Eritrea is the only country in Africa that came to power through the armed struggle. So, just like Cuba has been targeted by the Human Rights Watch and all these people and the CIA, Eritrea has faced the same sort of hostility. Because for one thing, Eritrea doesn't owe the IMF and the World Bank any money. They will refuse to take these predatory loans. They're the only country in Africa that hasn't taken these predatory loans from the World Bank and the IMF. So that right off should tip you off to the fact that, hey, Eritrea is unusual in Africa. They're going to stand on their own 2 feet, and they're not going to sell their souls for the short-term money offered them by these, I call them the Western banksters, these predatory financial institutions. And, when you go to Eritrea, they say it's a police state. You can hardly find a policeman on the street out there. I mean, the people are happy. Life is hard. I'm not saying everything's fine because they undergone sanctions for 9 years. There's sanctions and unofficial sanctions still punishing the country now. they're trying to make Eritrea kneel down. And Eritrea's motto is, we never kneel down. And now Abiy Ahmed and the Ethiopian people are starting to say, we'll never kneel down. And this is what's got all these organizations up in arms because, whoa, you get an independent voice in Africa. Now, a lot of people, Eritrea is a small country, easy to ignore, but Ethiopia is one of the 3 largest countries in Africa. And if Ethiopia follows the Eritrean footsteps of independence, nationalizing the land, getting away from these predatory loans, starting to work more with China, this is going to be a role model for the rest of Africa. Now, the reality is, especially for the Europeans, because the United States doesn't have that much economic influence in Africa, but the EU, the standard of living of the EU of the people is dependent on the super exploitation of Africa. EU could not maintain these people's high standard of living and education and healthcare and all these other things if they couldn't continue to rip off Africa, because Europe can no longer super exploit South America or Asia. Africa is the only place left where they can loot and plunder to their heart's content. And Ethiopia is standing up and setting a role model for the rest of Africa is a major threat to the EU's dominance of their own population. So of course the EU is going to have to hate Abiy Ahmed because he's moving towards Eritrea. And that means that they're going to be independent and eventually a socialist country like Eritrea is.
Well, I should admit to having been to Eritrea, I can see those similarities in terms of fighting blockades and sanctions as regards Eritrea and of course, Cuba. Thomas Mountain, I'll stop you there. More from the most widely distributed independent journalist in the whole of Africa after this break. Plus, is Ukraine the world's worst humanitarian crisis? Because the UN says it is Yemen, where British US armed warplanes bombed this week. We investigate. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. I'm still here with the renowned and most widely distributed independent journalist in the whole of Africa, Thomas Mountain. I've got to ask, since Oxfam is reporting drought conditions affecting food security right across Africa and then the global south, how has Eritrea managed to retain food security amidst the drought, amidst the climate change conditions?
Well, Eritrea, the president of Eritrea is a very far-sighted guy, quite brilliant, and he back in 2003, 2004, Eritrea had the first 2-year drought in history, back to back. And then in 2008, 2009, they were hammered again with a 2-year drought. So the president took most of Eritrea's resources and put them into water and soil conservation and has constructed 9 massive dams and over 700 smaller dams to store water so they can begin irrigating and not dependent upon rainfall for their very survival. So Eritrea has been able to overcome this rainfall dependence and now is basically food self-sufficient, which is what Eritrea is pushing Ethiopia and the rest of the Horn of Africa to start doing as well.
Wait, but so you're saying all the aid agencies, all the NGOs, all the people across the global south who administer regions where there is grave food insecurity, let alone places like Yemen, the world's worst humanitarian crisis, which of course is being bombed by US-UK arms, no one understands that there is a relatively, I'm not saying it's easy, I think you said the hard work of the Eritrean people are responsible. Some would say it's coercion. There is an answer to this that is not some kind of magic. And it's Africa's poor for a reason, not because it's Africa.
That's right. They don't want Africa to be independent and self-sufficient. They want Africa to be beggars. They want to be able to control the African leadership so that they can continue to super exploit the resources of the country. I mean, what are the oil companies paying? 8% royalty on their oil? I mean, Nigeria is supposed to be a rich country, but the poor people are hungry. Why? Because they're being ripped off for their oil. I mean, this is what the threat of a good example of Eritrea has now spread to Ethiopia. And the EU and all their lackeys, whether they're in their human rights organizations or in their media or their people in the UN, are all very concerned about Africa standing up and saying, we're not going to be dominated by the EU anymore. We're fed up with neocolonialism. I mean, that's become a big thing in Ethiopia now, neocolonialism. Why? Because the IMF and the World Bank are the way they control their economies. And by controlling their economies, they control their governments. And they turn these African countries into beggars. And Eritrea is saying, no, we cannot be beggars. We have to be self-sufficient. We have to have food security first and foremost. That's a question of national security, because without food security, you're going to be a beggar, and then your people are going to starve when they decide they don't. When the powers that be in the West decide that you are not towing the line.
Well, the IMF and World Bank say they've changed. We invite the TPLF on the program, and obviously those human rights organizations continue to condemn what they see as human rights abuses by the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments against the people of Tigray. Thomas Mountain, thank you.
Thank you.